While setting the table for my in-laws' anniversary dinner, I walked past the guest room and heard my wife say, "He's just a stepping stone. Once the papers are filed, I'm set for life." Her mom whispered, "Smart. Clean him out before he catches on." I finished arranging the plates and smiled through the toast like nothing was wrong. 3 days later, her lawyer reached out. But by then, I'd already burned the bridge they were planning to cross. I, 34M, thought I was living the perfect life. 5 years married, beautiful house in the suburbs, successful consulting business that I'd built from scratch. My wife had always been supportive of my work, or so I believed. Her parents were visiting for their 40th anniversary, and I wanted everything to be perfect. The dining room table gleamed under the chandelier as I carefully arranged the good china. Crystal glasses caught the light, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. I'd spent the afternoon cooking their favorite meal, roast lamb with rosemary, the same dish her mother had made for their first anniversary decades ago. The wine had been breathing for an hour, and the flowers I'd picked from our garden sat in an elegant centerpiece. I was adjusting the napkin placement when I heard voices drifting from the guest room upstairs. The house had excellent acoustics, something we'd always loved about its open design. Usually, that meant hearing laughter and conversation throughout the home. This time, it meant hearing something I was never supposed to hear. My wife's voice carried clearly down the hallway. She was explaining how I was just a stepping stone, how once the papers were filed, she'd be set for life. Her mother's response made my blood freeze. She called it smart planning, advised cleaning me out before I caught on to what was happening. I stood there holding a dessert fork, my hand trembling slightly as the words sank in. 5 years of marriage, of building something together, of trust and shared dreams. All of it reduced to a calculated financial move. I was nothing more than a target, a mark they'd been playing for years. But I didn't storm upstairs. I didn't confront them. Instead, I finished setting the table with mechanical precision, arranging each piece of silverware exactly where it belonged. When they came downstairs 20 minutes later, I greeted them with the same warm smile I'd always worn. Dinner proceeded exactly as planned. I carved the lamb with steady hands, poured wine with a gracious flourish, and listened to her father's stories about their early years together. When he raised his glass to toast 40 years of marriage, I clinked my glass against everyone else's and spoke about the beauty of lasting commitment. My wife squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back. Her mother complimented the meal, saying I'd outdone myself. I thanked her graciously and mentioned how much I valued family. My wife beamed at me across the table, playing the role of the loving spouse to perfection. If I hadn't heard those words in the guest room, I would have believed every gesture, every smile, every affectionate touch. The evening ended with coffee and cake in the living room. I showed her father my latest woodworking project in the garage, and we discussed his retirement plans. Her mother helped with dishes, praising my domestic skills and joking about how lucky her daughter was to have found such a catch. I laughed along, agreeing that we made a great team. After they retired to the guest room, my wife and I cleaned up the remaining dishes together. She thanked me for making the evening so special, said her parents had been impressed by the effort I'd put in. She suggested we should host more family dinners, that we were good at creating these memorable experiences together. I agreed completely, kissing her goodnight before heading to my home office to catch up on some work. But instead of opening client files, I spent the night researching divorce law and asset protection strategies. I learned about hidden accounts, property transfers, and the importance of documentation. By dawn, I had a clear understanding of what she was probably planning and how to protect myself. The next morning felt surreal. I made breakfast for everyone, packed lunches for my wife's workday, and kissed her goodbye at the front door. Her parents thanked me again for the wonderful evening before starting their drive home. Everything appeared completely normal on the surface. But underneath, I was calculating. My consulting business existed as an LLC with complex ownership structures. Most of our assets were tied up in investments that would be difficult to value or divide quickly. The house was jointly owned, but I'd been making the majority of payments from my business accounts. I started wondering how long she'd been planning this, how many conversations had happened without my knowledge. Over the next 3 days, I maintained perfect normalcy. I took on new client projects, scheduled business meetings, and even suggested we plan a weekend getaway for the following month. She seemed pleased by my enthusiasm, perhaps thinking her plan was proceeding smoothly. Meanwhile, I was busy behind the scenes. I contacted my business attorney, not about divorce, but about restructuring my company for tax purposes. I moved certain assets into protected accounts, consolidated others, and created a paper trail that would make any future division more complex. I wasn't hiding anything illegal, just organizing my financial house in ways that would make her lawyer's job significantly more challenging. I also started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. Her phone habits, her schedule, the new clothes she'd been buying. Little things that might indicate whether this was just financial opportunism or if there were other factors involved. What I discovered was methodical preparation. She'd been setting up her own separate accounts, consulting with professionals, and documenting everything she thought might benefit her case. The lawyer's call came exactly when I expected it. 3 days after the anniversary dinner, a professional voice informed me that my wife was filing for divorce and that I should expect to receive official papers soon. The attorney suggested I might want to retain counsel and mentioned that they hoped we could work together to reach an amicable settlement. I listened politely, thanked them for the courtesy call, and said I looked forward to resolving everything fairly. After hanging up, I sat in my office for several minutes, staring out the window at the garden where I'd picked flowers for that anniversary dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been decorating my own execution, but they had miscalculated badly. While they were planning to exploit my trust and generosity, I'd already started protecting myself. The bridge they intended to cross had been systematically dismantled, beam by beam, nail by nail. When my wife came home that evening, I was cooking dinner as usual. She seemed nervous, perhaps anticipating that the lawyer would have contacted me by now. She asked about my day, mentioned she'd been thinking about our future together, wondered if I'd given any thought to making some changes in our lives. I told her I'd actually been thinking along similar lines, that sometimes relationships reach natural transition points where people need to reassess their priorities. She seemed relieved by my understanding tone, probably assuming I was going to make her plan easier to execute. We ate dinner in what felt like companionable silence. She cleared the table while I loaded the dishwasher, and we settled into the living room to watch a movie together. During a commercial break, she mentioned that she'd been talking to some friends about relationship counseling, wondering if professional guidance might help couples work through major decisions together. I agreed that professional help could be valuable, especially when people needed to make significant life changes. I suggested she should definitely pursue whatever resources she felt would be most beneficial. She squeezed my hand and said she appreciated how supportive I was being about everything. The next morning, I received the divorce papers via certified mail. I signed for them calmly, thanked the delivery person, and set the envelope on my desk without opening it. I already knew what they contained, and I was ready. Update 1. My attorney was impressed by the groundwork I'd already laid. She explained that my preemptive asset protection measures were completely legal and would significantly complicate any attempts to claim half of what I'd built. The business restructuring alone would require months of evaluation by forensic accountants, and the protected assets were effectively untouchable. But the real surprise came when we started discovery. My wife's lawyer had apparently promised her a quick settlement based on the assumption that I was naive and unprepared. They'd calculated her potential payout based on outdated financial information and hadn't anticipated that I might have taken protective measures. When they realized what they were up against, the tone changed dramatically. The initial demands were quietly reduced, then reduced again. My wife's mother started calling, leaving voicemails about how families should stick together and work things out amicably. I listened to each message with detached interest, remembering her whispered advice about cleaning me out before I caught on. Meanwhile, I was thriving professionally. The business was growing rapidly, partly because I was channeling all my energy into work instead of trying to maintain a failing marriage. New clients were impressed by my focus and dedication, and revenue was exceeding projections by significant margins. My wife tried a different approach. She suggested we could still work things out, that maybe we'd been too hasty in filing papers. She mentioned how much she missed our conversations, our shared meals, the comfortable routine we'd established together. She wondered if we might consider couples therapy after all, really give our marriage another chance. I listened sympathetically and acknowledged that we had built something meaningful together. But I also mentioned that trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. I suggested that perhaps we should focus on ending things respectfully rather than trying to resurrect something that had already died. She asked what I meant about trust being broken, and I described overhearing the conversation in the guest room during her parents' anniversary dinner. I watched her face change as she realized her plan had been exposed from the very beginning. The calculating look that replaced her confusion confirmed everything I'd suspected about her motivations. The final settlement was reached 6 months later. She received significantly less than she'd originally demanded, and I retained control of the business and most of the assets I'd worked to build. The house was sold, and we split the proceeds after paying off the mortgage and associated costs. Update 2. A year later, I was living in a smaller but more comfortable place, spending my time on work I was passionate about and relationships that were genuine. My business had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined possible during my marriage, partly because I was no longer distracted by maintaining a facade. I occasionally heard updates through mutual friends. My ex-wife had moved back in with her parents temporarily, was working in a job that paid considerably less than she'd hoped, and was struggling to adjust to a lifestyle that didn't include the financial security she'd taken for granted. Her mother, according to these reports, was not pleased with how things had turned out. The friends who provided these updates seemed to expect some reaction from me: satisfaction, regret, concern. But I felt mostly indifferent. She'd made her choices based on calculation rather than genuine feeling, and those choices had natural consequences. I harbored no particular ill will, but I also felt no responsibility for the outcome she'd created for herself. What struck me most was how different I felt about relationships in general. The experience had taught me to pay attention to actions rather than words, to trust patterns of behavior rather than declarations of feeling. It had also shown me the value of protecting what you build, not out of paranoia, but out of reasonable caution. I started dating again eventually, but with much clearer boundaries and expectations. I was upfront about having been through a difficult divorce, about having learned hard lessons about trust and compatibility. Some people were put off by this honesty, but others appreciated the directness and emotional maturity it represented. The consulting business continued growing. I hired additional staff, expanded into new markets, and developed a reputation for reliability and ethical practices. Clients often remarked on my focused approach and attention to detail. What they didn't know was that these qualities had been sharpened by necessity, refined through experience that had cost me personally, but taught me professionally. I never regretted staying calm during that anniversary dinner, never wished I'd confronted the situation dramatically in the moment. The measured response had given me time to think clearly and act strategically. It had also revealed the true character of people I'd trusted, allowing me to make decisions based on complete information rather than emotional reaction. Update 3. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call. My ex-wife's father had suffered a heart attack, and she was reaching out to let me know about the funeral arrangements. Despite everything that had happened between us, she thought I should know because I'd always gotten along well with him. I appreciated the gesture and attended the service. Her father had been a good man caught between loyalty to his daughter and recognition that their plan had been ethically questionable. During our conversations in the garage that night, I'd sensed his discomfort with the situation, though I hadn't understood the context at the time. At the reception afterward, her mother approached me. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered. She apologized for her role in what had happened, said she'd been trying to protect her daughter, but had given terrible advice. She mentioned that the whole experience had damaged their relationship as well, that trust had been broken in multiple directions. I accepted her apology graciously, but didn't offer false reassurance. Some actions have consequences that extend beyond their immediate targets, affecting entire networks of relationships. She was discovering that manipulation often backfires, creating the very instability it's designed to avoid. My ex-wife and I spoke briefly at the funeral. She looked tired, older, less confident than during our marriage. She asked how I was doing, mentioned that she'd heard the business was going well. I confirmed that things were stable and asked about her own situation. She was working in marketing now, had her own apartment, was slowly rebuilding her life. We didn't discuss the divorce or the events that led to it. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement that those topics belonged in the past. But I noticed she didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the planning and deception that had characterized our final months together. Perhaps she couldn't bring herself to admit the full extent of what she'd attempted, or perhaps she still believed her actions had been justified. I drove home thinking about patterns and consequences, about the long-term effects of short-term decisions. She'd traded a stable marriage and comfortable lifestyle for what she'd hoped would be a larger financial payout. The gamble hadn't paid off, and she was now rebuilding from a much more difficult position than if she'd simply asked for an honest conversation about our future. Meanwhile, I'd learned valuable lessons about protecting what matters, about paying attention to warning signs, about the importance of acting strategically rather than emotionally. The experience had been painful but ultimately educational, forcing growth that might not have occurred otherwise. The business continued expanding. I'd developed expertise in crisis management and strategic planning that served clients well in difficult situations. Personal experience with deception and manipulation had taught me to recognize similar patterns in professional contexts, making me better at protecting client interests and navigating complex negotiations. 3 years later, I was in a serious relationship with someone who shared my values about honesty and mutual respect. We'd met through work, developed trust gradually, and built something based on genuine compatibility rather than convenience or calculation. She knew about my divorce and the lessons I'd learned from it, but she also saw how those experiences had contributed to my character development. Looking back on that anniversary dinner, I felt grateful for the clarity it had provided. Without overhearing that conversation, I might have remained oblivious until it was too late to protect myself. The betrayal had been painful, but discovering it early had prevented much greater damage. I'd learned that sometimes the most important moments happen when we think nobody is paying attention, when people reveal their true intentions because they believe they're safe from observation. Those moments of accidental honesty can be devastating, but they can also be gifts that allow us to make informed decisions about our future. The bridge they'd planned to cross had indeed been burned, but not in the way they'd intended. Instead of becoming a pathway to easy money, it had become a barrier that protected me from further manipulation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim someone expects you to be, building something better while they're left to deal with the consequences of their own choices. The anniversary dinner had been intended as a celebration of lasting love and commitment. In an ironic way, it had served exactly that purpose. It had taught me what genuine commitment actually looks like and what it doesn't. That lesson, expensive as it was, had ultimately made possible the kind of relationship I'd always wanted but hadn't known how to recognize or protect.